Hello, and welcome to another lesson with Miss Washington. Today, we're going to learn about natural selection and how Charles Darwin became the father of modern evolution. We're going to learn about how animals naturally evolved over millions of years. In this presentation, we're going to learn about how the process of natural selection and what exactly it is brings about change in a species over time. We just finished talking about the inheritance of traits in individuals and their families in pedigrees in Unit 5. Now we're going to learn about how traits are inherited in whole populations, which are groups of individuals of a species living in a specific area at a specific given time. So the population here at Durham, at Hillside High School in Durham, North Carolina, in 2021 is different than the population at Hillside High School in Durham, North Carolina in 2013. Same species, same area, same time. Remember, evolution is a change of a species over time. Species today are different from millions of years ago. We have this huge diversity now. We all seem to have arisen from, or it's theorized that we have arisen from one single organism, the first organism, a prokaryote. So who was Charles Darwin?
Who was Charles Darwin?
Charles Darwin was an English naturalist who was fascinated with nature.
But not an ordinary naturalist with an ordinary fascination with nature.
Hello. What are you doing here?
Why such beauty when no one can see?
In 1831, Charles Darwin was only 22 when he began a 5-year voyage aboard the British ship HMS Beagle to explore, observe, and study the natural world. The Beagle sailed throughout South America and to remote places like the Galapagos Islands off Ecuador. Darwin later wrote that he felt like a blind man being given sight. He returned to England with his mind and notebooks full of fantastic images.
What a brilliant red.
Nothing seemed too insignificant for his scrutiny.
He kept detailed records of what he saw during his voyage on the Beagle. He collected fossils. He kept detailed recordings of plants and animals. He drew them. He observed them.
Little did Darwin realize that his years on the Beagle would begin a lifetime of hard work and controversy.
The greatest scientists of Darwin's day referred to the appearance of species originally as the mystery of mysteries. Now, Darwin was an ambitious young man, and he decided to tackle this greatest mystery in the biology of his day.
Darwin took on the task of unraveling this mystery methodically, with patience and care. Gradually, one simple and elegant idea became more and more clear to him: that all living things are related. It was a conclusion that to Darwin could not be escaped. But he also knew he was in dangerous waters. He rarely shared his thoughts with others, but his brother was an exception.
The similarity of structure indicates one thing and one thing only. An ancient common ancestor. Real flesh and blood parents.
Why didn't you say so then? You must publish your ideas, if only to establish your priority. What's holding you back?
You have to understand that Darwin was a respectable man. His father was a well-known physician. He came from a well-known family. He went to Cambridge University to train for the Church of England, and he knew eminent scientists of his day.
In Darwin's time, the prevailing explanation for the great diversity of life was a literal interpretation of the Earth's creation as described in Genesis. the first book of the Bible.
Established naturalists believe that God created each individual species of animals and plants, usually miraculously, at the beginning, and that these species had stayed fixed.
We allow the planets and the sun to be governed by natural laws. But the smallest insect we wish to be created by a special act of God. Surely the creation of life has to be explained in the same way as geology, using natural, ordinary, everyday causes.
Well, in theory, yes, but in practice, there can be no question about the prime cause. Divine will.
Shouldn't men of science be free to investigate each and every means by which new species come into being?
If by that you mean wild accusations about man's ancestry, the answer is no.
He was doing something highly unorthodox in his day. Not unorthodox because it went against the church per se, but because it went against all of natural history in Great Britain. He knew he stood to jeopardize the whole united establishment of science, politics, and the church. He knew that he could get into very, very bad trouble and ruin his career.
And yet Darwin also knew the evidence he gathered and the tests he conducted supported the revolutionary idea that living things are related and have changed over millions and millions of years. This new way of thinking was a mark of his genius. It took Darwin 23 years of work to overcome his own doubts to finally present his ideas to the world. His revolutionary book, The Origin of Species, introduced a scientific theory to explain how evolution occurs. He called his mechanism of change natural selection.
Darwin had the courage to go against what was believed in those days, and it changed the world in a profound way.
One of the remarkable things about Darwin's contribution that is, I think, too seldom appreciated is he didn't just tell us how we got here. He told us, in a sense, why biology makes sense. The sequences of our genes, the structures of our body, and even our instincts in terms of behavior all make sense and all tie together because of evolution.
If I were to give a prize for the single best idea anybody ever had, I'd give it to Darwin for the idea of natural selection. Ahead of Newton, ahead of Einstein, it was Darwin's great stroke to see how to unite the facts about the excellence of design of all the different species. He understood that what he was proposing was a truly revolutionary idea.
In Westminster Abbey, there's an area called Scientist's Corner. There, in the company of that other revolutionary scientific thinker, Sir Isaac Newton, lies Charles Darwin.
So, in 3 words on your notes, or maybe just 1 or 2, describe who you think Charles Darwin was. Not only was he the father of modern evolution, but what else was he to you? So, in his theory of natural selection, he outlined 5 key principles. These need to exist in the population in order for there to be a wide margin of natural selection. The first principle is that there has to be genetic variation or differences in DNA, differences in your genes. There's a lot of variation in the human population. People have different ages, heights, weights, hair colors, skin colors, eye colors, and so many other differences about them. These differences in the human population come from mutations and sexual reproduction. Remember, mutations are those random changes in our DNA sequences or our protein sequences. And sexual reproduction, the process of combining gametes, the egg and the sperm, brings together different combinations of genes each time. During the process of meiosis, making those sex cells, each time sex cells are made, 4 genetically different cells with half the number of chromosomes are produced each time. And so if 4 different cells are produced each time, and they're randomly assorted and recombining chromosomes in the process, the human population, as you see today, has the most genetic variation. His second principle of natural selection was that organisms need to produce more offspring than can survive. Take frogs, for example. They produce hundreds to thousands of eggs, but very few of them will survive because most of them will be eaten before they reach adulthood. Because of the hostile environment and where the frogs are on the food chain, they have to make more offspring so that they can have a chance to pass on at least just a few of their genes. Humans are at the top of the food chain. Because we are able to take care of our young, because we are able to live a lot longer, humans do not need to make more offspring than can survive. The third principle that Darwin's theory of natural selection entails is competition. Because there are more organisms that are produced than can survive, members of a species end up competing for limited resources like food and water, space and shelter, and even mates. It's all about the survival of the fittest. The fourth principle is that some members of a population have advantageous traits or adaptations that allow them to survive better than other organisms in their environment. These organisms that have these advantageous traits, these adaptations, are able to survive and reproduce and pass on those traits to their kids. Camouflage is an example of an adaptation. It allows animals to hide in plain sight. This helps them to survive by avoiding predators. Lastly, Darwin's theory of natural selection said that there must be speciation. In order for us to evolve over long periods of time, there must be speciation. Speciation is that over long periods of time and given a steady input of new variation into a population, these processes lead to the development of new species. So over time, with more mutations, with more introductions of different species to a species, and mating and sexual reproduction, a species can become a whole new species. Let's watch this video.
There are almost 10,000 known bird species on the planet. How did they evolve into so many unique forms? Take the birds of paradise, for example, with their dizzying array of colors, shapes, and sizes. From genetic evidence, we know that the ancestor of all 39 species was a plain, crow-like bird. And the process that caused this one species to split into many is called speciation. Before we explain speciation, let's talk about what we mean when we use the word species. According to the classic definition, species are groups of actually or potentially interbreeding natural populations which are reproductively isolated from other groups. Speciation begins when groups become separated in space or become different enough in form and behavior that individuals from one group no longer regularly mate with individuals outside the group. One way for a new species to evolve starts when a few individuals colonize a new area that is outside their native range. Take, for example, a volcanic island that rises out of the sea just off the coast of the mainland. Over millions of years, as the island grows larger and less volcanically active, plants begin to grow, but there are no birds here yet. Then one day, birds from a common species on the mainland are blown over by a storm and start a new population. If these birds move between the island and the mainland only rarely, the conditions for reproductive isolation are set, and the brand new island population is on its way to becoming a new species. Over thousands of generations, the two populations will be shaped by natural and sexual selection into separate forms, each with a unique genetic fingerprint. But at what point are we confident that this island population has really changed enough to become a new species? Well, let's put our definition to the test. If we introduce a female from the mainland species to a potential mate from the island after 200 generations in isolation, about 400 years in bird terms, will they mate? It appears that these two still recognize each other as members of the same species. How about after another 1,000 generations of isolation? Now, the female finds this island male's song a bit strange, but she still chooses to mate with him. What if we fast forward again to 10,000 generations of isolation? This time, the female doesn't even recognize the male song and is completely uninterested. If this female's mating preferences are widespread in the population, we now have two bona fide species, mainland and island. But these kinds of dating matchups don't happen in reality. Here, because our birds avoid flights across the open ocean, island birds do not regularly encounter mainland birds. Because genes from the two populations no longer intermix, genetic differences accumulate, and the two populations become different species. So in practice, scientists classify species separated in space by their genetic differences, not by observing blind dates. But there is another kind of speciation that can occur when a habitat becomes divided and a once widespread bird population becomes fragmented. Imagine that our new island grows larger over time and the volcano develops a central mountain ridge while a valley forms along the eastern coast. Over time, the eastern birds, who have plentiful fruit resources and only need a single parent to successfully raise young, evolve specialized mating systems. Males compete for multiple mates and, to get noticed, evolve fancy plumage and display behaviors. On one side of the valley, the males evolve elaborate head plumes, and on the other, it's the tails that get fancy. At the same time, Western birds are consistently dealing with harsher food conditions and do not evolve a specialized mating system or fancy feathers. Just as before, early in the speciation process, when individuals from isolated populations meet, our eastern and western birds readily mate. But as generations pass and the eastern males become fancier, the western females begin to find the eastern male's habits foreign and surprising. But these traits are clearly not deal breakers. Even after 10,000 generations of geographic isolation, some of the western females continue to find the male's displays attractive. At this stage, the eggs she lays aren't viable because the separated populations have evolved too many genetic differences to be compatible. To review, in this kind of speciation, geographic barriers have split the habitat into 3 fragments, and on each, a unique species evolved. What if the southwestern slope erodes into a low peninsula, allowing southeastern birds to mix with the western birds? By this time, their mating systems are completely different, and the two species can't create fertile offspring. Now, related species can coexist, but because they no longer successfully interbreed, there's no going back. So how did the 39 bird of paradise species evolve from one crow-like ancestor? New Guinea and the surrounding islands where birds of paradise evolved have changed dramatically throughout geologic time, repeatedly isolating populations. Over thousands of generations in isolation, natural and sexual selection have morphed the fragmented populations into a wonderful array of colorful species. The process of speciation is ongoing, and split after split, new and unique organisms evolve. Incredibly, all those 10,000 bird species we see today evolved from one single bird ancestor. And it's thanks to the evolutionary processes driving speciation that our planet is home to such impressive biodiversity.
So over time, birds were able to change, sometimes to the point where they weren't even compatible anymore. And how one bird turned into 10,000 birds, all of a different species. So let's look at this example of beetles in a population. There are two variations of beetles in this population, green and blue. And the green beetles are eaten by crows that favor the green variety. Excuse me, the beetles are eaten by crows that favor the green variety. So let's say the green beetles taste like sour candy and the blue beetles taste like black licorice, gross. And so over time, those green beetles taste super delicious and they're selected for over and over and over and over again to the point where there are no more green beetles. And so in this case, being a blue beetle is considered an adaptation or an advantage because you have a trait that helps you to survive, or because the blue beetles have a trait that helps them to survive and not get eaten by predators and be able to reproduce and pass on their genes. So when the green beetles reproduce, they reproduce a good bit of the population. Now there are more blue beetles in the population. I know there may be some confusion about green beetles still existing in the population. However, these blue and green beetles were a part of the same species. So in both of their DNA and both of their genetic makeups, they have the genes to be green and they have the genes to be blue. So when the blue beetles continue to mate, you still see the green variation pop up. Now, if this continues over many generations and the green beetles continue to be eaten and the blue beetles continue to reproduce, or maybe they mutate or other beetles come to mate with these beetles could become an entirely new species. Here's another example of natural selection here.
To help explain how natural selection works, books will often refer to the story of the peppered moth. Here you see how different they can look. The story begins where 80% of the population of peppered moths were white. This worked out really well because they spent most of their time on birch trees that had white barks and camouflaged them from predators. Only about 2% of the moths were born with an odd black color, and this was a bad characteristic to have. The black color made it easy for predators to spot them, and so the black moths had a very difficult time surviving in the environment. But then, in the early 1800s, England's Industrial Revolution changed everything for the moths. Manufacturing started to boom, and more factories developed. Factory smoke and pollutants discolored the white birch trees, and the environmental conditions started to change. The once white trees were now dark and hid the black moths from the dangerous predators. Now the white moths were the unfortunate ones, and the black moths were the ones better suited for survival. Oops. All right. So you can see, they're targeting those white moths. All right, so now the next part, you see me playing this game that is directly related to these moths. And I'm the bird, and I'm hunting down, my prey, and I'm trying to search for moths to eat. You can see that it's far easier for me to find the white moths than it is to catch the black moths. All right, so you see me catching them, you can see me catching them. It really is so much easier. And occasionally I'll get a black moth, and I think looking at it right now, there's a point where I keep flying over the same black moth that's just sitting there, and I just don't notice it. So I'm chasing, occasionally I'll get the black moth. Right now I'm just targeting on the black moth. There's a white one and I catch right away. And so as a result, where we started at 50-50 white and black, right now it's 56% dark moths and 44% white moths, only because I couldn't see the black moths, I couldn't catch them. All right, so the peppered moth, and again, this is in England, the black species started out at 2%, and it rose to almost 95% in some areas of England. And this is an example of natural selection. And it shows that the black moths were more fit, as they say. They were stronger. They had a characteristic that better fit their environment. And this is also an example, a rare example, of industrial melanism. And industrial melanism is the idea that an organism...
So, in that example, the white moths displayed the adaptation not to be selected for. They were able to hide from their predators, but after the industrialization in the area caused the smog to darken the trees to black, now being a black moth was considered an adaptation, and the white moths were naturally selected for. And so the population shifts based off of the environment that it's in, or the influences of the environment. So here's some questions to think about. Who was Charles Darwin and what was his theory? What were the 5 principles? And then give some examples of genetic variation, competition, and adaptations. Make sure to answer your comprehension questions. Thanks, and have a great day.